Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do to get started on this job is to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all of your lug nuts and the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a nice clear view of our outer tie rod end. We're going to go ahead and remove our cotter pin from that and then remove the nut so we can remove the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Put that nut on there just a couple threads, break it free. Now let's come right here on the other side of the knuckle. We're going to remove this bolt that holds the flex hose to it, and then we'll continue on by removing the caliper bracket bolts. These are 10 millimeter. Now we can see our two bracket bolts. There's one here, and there's one located up along the top. Leave that one in a couple threads, fully remove the other one. Now we're going to take this and we're going to hang it so it's putting no pressure on our flex hose. Now we're going to follow that ABS wire, disconnect the ABS from the knuckle right here using a 10 millimeter. Get that little bolt. Inspect your ABS sensor. This looks good. I'll set it aside. Use some penetrant. The next thing we're going to do is remove our rotor. You're going to find some mounting bolts that look like this. Let's use our torque socket here. This is a T30. Put that on there. Remove your rotor. Now let's use a 32 millimeter socket to remove our axle nut. Let's use a hammer and a punch, come right in the center of the axle, and make sure it's freed up from the wheel bearing. Now we're going to move along to the upper ball joint. Remove this with a 17 millimeter socket. Just going to leave that on a couple threads. Now I'm going to separate this ball joint. There we are. Now we're going to bring this down carefully, making sure we're not putting a tug on our axle. Now we're going to move underneath the knuckle. You're going to find two ball joints here. We want to remove both of these nuts, and we're going to leave them on there just a tiny bit, so that way there we can separate the ball joint from the knuckle. Now let's just give these a couple loving bonks, separate them. There it is, friends. Now the next thing we want to do is start removing these from the ball joints themselves. They're kind of like a little coupler on there. The new knuckle came with these, so we're just going to get these right off of there. There's one. We'll set that aside, do the same to the other one. Now it's time to install our brand new knuckle assembly. We're going to carefully slide it over the axle splines, line up both of our lower ball joint studs. Let's start the nuts on those. Let's start this one on there. Let's bottom this out. Bottom both of these out. Now we're going to torque both of these lower ball joints to 148 foot-pounds. Now let's do the upper ball joint, 35 foot-pounds. Now let's put some copper never sees on our bearing mating surface. Clean up the backside of your rotor, make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Now let's take our mounting bolt, start it in, snug it up. Now we can get this caliper bracket on here. Slide the pads right over the rotor. Now we're going to take both of our mounting bolts, a little bit of red thread locker, we'll start them in, snug them up, then torque them to 66 foot-pounds. Now let's get this bracket for our flex hose onto the knuckle here. Now let's get our ABS sensor reattached. Put this bolt in there. Make sure it's nice and snug. Let's take our outer tie rod end, slide it right up and into the knuckle here. Take that nut, we'll start it on there and snug it up. Now we're just going to bottom it out. We'll torque this to 35 foot-pounds. After that, we want to make sure that the slots on the nut are lined up with the hole in the stud. If they aren't, you're just going to tighten it until the very next one does. Make sure you put in your locking cotter pin. Trim off any excess. Now we're going to do the axle nut. Let's go ahead and put this right on here. We're going to go ahead and bottom this out with a ratchet, and then we'll torque it to manufacturer's specifications. Now let's torque the axle nut to 189 foot-pounds. If it seems like it's turning on you, just carefully put a pry bar in between. Now the next thing we want to do is peen this axle nut down into here. That way there it can't loosen up on us while we're driving down the road. There we are. Now we'll just put our wheel up on here, start all of our lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel safely on the ground, and then we'll torque the lug nuts to 103 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got it all back together. What's left to do now? Go ahead and pump up your brakes and then take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.